Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking a deep dive into Brené Brown's Daring Greatly, which has really made an impact. And today, we're going to explore why. The book focuses on vulnerability and how it connects to shame and how ultimately we can live more wholeheartedly.
And what's interesting is that we are going beyond just summarizing the book. We have reviews from three very different perspectives: a therapist, a leadership coach, and even an MFT student. And so you get to see how Daring Greatly lands with different people who are applying it in their own lives and in their work.
Okay, so let's unpack Brown's core message. Vulnerability, which we often see as a weakness, is actually the key to courage, connection, and authenticity.
Yeah,
That seems so counterintuitive to how we are often raised.
it really does challenge the way we're conditioned to think. We're often taught to hide our flaws and to put on a brave face. But Brown argues that by embracing vulnerability, we actually open ourselves up to deeper connections and a more genuine way of living.
I love how the MFT Students Review brought this to life with the story about her professor talking about the field of suck. Can you explain that a bit more for our listeners?
Absolutely. The field of suck is a way of describing the messy, uncomfortable stage we all go through when we're trying to learn something new. It's that period where we feel awkward, incompetent, maybe even ashamed. But the point is that to truly grow, you have to be willing to wade into that field of suck, be vulnerable enough to make mistakes and learn from them.
Yeah, it sounds like you can't skip over that, really.
Exactly.
That's part of the process.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm starting to see how this connects to the Leadership Coach's Review. They emphasize how vulnerability is critical for effective leadership.
That's true. Vulnerability isn't just about personal growth, but it plays a huge role in building trust and fostering creativity within teams. When leaders are willing to show their vulnerability, it creates a safe space for others to do the same, which leads to more open communication and better collaboration.
Makes sense. And that reminds me of that saying, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And showing vulnerability really shows that you care. Okay, let's shift gears a bit to another major theme, shame resilience. This was a big part of all the reviews, especially the one from the therapist.
Shame is something Brown has spent a lot of time researching, and she defines it as that intensely painful feeling of being unworthy of connection, of being fundamentally flawed. And she argues that this feeling of shame, it affects all of us to some degree.
So it's not just about those like big moments where we feel embarrassed or humiliated. It's a deeper, more pervasive feeling
Right.
that can really hold us back.
Exactly. And the Conchite Coaching Review broke down Brown's 4 steps to building shame resilience. First, you have to recognize your shame triggers, those specific situations or thoughts that tend to bring up feelings of unworthiness. So once you're aware of your triggers, you can start to practice critical awareness by questioning the negative thoughts and beliefs that fuel the shame.
So instead of just accepting those thoughts as truth,
Right.
you start to examine them. And
Exactly.
like, where do they come from? Are they even realistic?
Yeah. The next step is reaching out and sharing your experience with someone you trust. Shame thrives in isolation, so talking about it can be incredibly powerful in breaking its hold on you. And finally, speaking shame, by talking openly about it, we take away its power and begin to heal.
So it sounds like shame resilience isn't about eliminating shame altogether, but rather developing the skills to navigate it when it inevitably shows up.
Precisely. It's about learning to ride the waves of shame rather than getting swept away by them. Now, shifting gears once more, let's explore Brown's idea of wholehearted living, which really stood out in the Lydia mini review.
This is where Brown contrasts what she calls a culture of scarcity with the concept of enough or wholeheartedness.
And the review really brought this to life by describing the culture of scarcity as that constant feeling of never enough money, success, beauty, love. It's that relentless comparison to some unattainable ideal that leaves us feeling perpetually inadequate.
It's like we're always striving, always chasing, but never truly arriving.
Exactly. And Brown argues that the antidote to this is wholeheartedness. Believing that you are worthy of love and belonging just as you are, flaws and all. It's about embracing self-acceptance and self-compassion instead of chasing external validation.
And she has this fantastic quote in the book: the opposite of scarcity is enough, or wholeheartedness, facing uncertainty, exposure, and emotional risks, and knowing that I am enough.
And that's the crux of it. It's not about achieving some external measure of success. It's about cultivating a deep sense of self-worth and embracing who you are, imperfections and all.
This makes me think about how we often try to protect ourselves from vulnerability by putting up walls or shields, which Brown refers to as vulnerability armor.
Right. And the Conchai Coaching Review dove into some specific examples of these shields, like foreboding joy, perfectionism, and numbing, especially in the context of the workplace. They illustrated how these shields, while seemingly protective, actually prevent us from experiencing true connection and joy.
So instead of shielding ourselves, what Brown seems to be suggesting is that we need to learn to be more comfortable with discomfort, to embrace those feelings of vulnerability as part of the human experience.
Yes. And that's where the idea of the field of suck comes back into play. It's about learning to navigate those uncomfortable feelings, knowing that they are a necessary part of growth and change.
You know, it's been such a rich conversation so far.
Hmm.
We've covered so much ground, from the power of vulnerability to the importance of shame resilience to embracing wholehearted living, but we've only scratched the surface. There's still so much more to explore.
Absolutely. We are just getting started. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll delve into those specific examples of vulnerability armor, how they can show up in our lives, and most importantly, what we can do to overcome them. So stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into daring greatly.
Yeah.
Before we move on, I want to touch on something you mentioned earlier, the idea that vulnerability isn't something we should just throw around haphazardly. Right, it's not about being an open book to everyone you meet. It's about choosing carefully who we share those more vulnerable parts of ourselves with.
Exactly. Brown is very clear about the importance of being discerning with who we choose to be vulnerable with. Sharing our true selves with people who have earned the right to hear our story, people who have demonstrated trustworthiness and empathy.
Okay,
Yeah.
that makes sense. So let's get back to those vulnerability armor examples from the Conchai Coaching Review. They really painted a vivid picture of how these shields can show up in the workplace.
They did. One example that stuck with me was the senior executive who lands a major deal for the company, but instead of celebrating this huge win, they immediately start worrying about everything that could go wrong.
It's like they can't even allow themselves to enjoy the success.
Yeah.
They're already bracing for the potential failure.
Classic foreboding joy. And the review pointed out how draining that kind of mindset can be, not just for the executive, but for the whole team. Imagine working with a leader who's constantly anticipating the worst-case scenario.
Right, that sounds exhausting.
It would be exhausting.
So what's the antidote to this foreboding joy?
Well, the review suggests focusing on gratitude. Make a conscious effort to acknowledge the win publicly with their team, foster a culture of appreciation. Something as simple as starting team meetings with, like a success moment, can help shift the focus from fear to gratitude.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
That's a good idea. Shifting your attention to what's working well.
Yeah.
Okay, and speaking of shifting focus, let's talk about another shield, perfectionism. The review highlighted this through the example of a VP of marketing who's trying to create the perfect presentation.
Right.
I think we've all been there
We have.
at some point.
Hmm.
That fear of judgment and criticism can be so paralyzing.
And in the case of this VP, it led to delays, an inability to delegate, ultimately burnout, for both themselves and their team. Perfectionism can be so insidious because it often masquerades as striving for excellence.
But it's really about avoiding shame and judgment.
Exactly. And the antidote, according to the review, is a healthy dose of self-compassion and a good enough mindset. So instead of striving for flawlessness, which is an impossible standard, the VP could focus on getting a solid first draft out there and then getting feedback, iterating.
Progress over perfection.
Right. And it creates a much healthier and more collaborative work environment. When leaders model that it's okay to not be perfect, it gives permission for the whole team to embrace a more balanced and sustainable approach to work.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, let's tackle the final shield, numbing. The review used the example of a CEO who's so overwhelmed by the demands of their job that they turn to workaholism as a way to avoid dealing with feelings of inadequacy and exhaustion.
Yeah, workaholism is a tricky one because it's often seen as a badge of honor in our culture. But as the review pointed out, it's really just a way of numbing ourselves to uncomfortable emotions.
It's like ignoring the check engine light on your car.
Yes.
You might be able to keep driving for a while, but eventually something's going to give.
Yeah. Exactly. And the long-term consequences can be serious. Burnout, health problems, damaged relationships. The review emphasized the importance of setting boundaries, scheduling regular downtime, and developing healthy coping mechanisms.
It's about recognizing that rest and self-care aren't luxuries, they're necessities.
Exactly. And it's important for leaders to model this for their teams as well, talking openly about the importance of taking breaks, vacations.
Hmm.
Setting limits sends a powerful message that well-being matters.
I think that's so key. As we're talking about these examples, it's striking me that these shields foreboding joy, perfectionism, numbing money, they don't just show up in the workplace. Like I can see how I use perfectionism in my personal relationships sometimes too.
Absolutely. I think that's what makes Brown's work so resonant. It's not just about professional development, it's about understanding the human experience and how these patterns play out in all areas of our lives. We all have our own versions of vulnerability armor that
Hmm.
we put on to protect ourselves.
So how do we start to take off this armor? It can feel pretty daunting to try and change these deeply ingrained patterns.
That's a great question. And I think a good place to start is with self-awareness. Recognizing the shields we're using and understanding how they might be holding us back from experiencing true connection and joy.
So becoming aware of when we're using them and how they might be impacting us.
Right. And then from there, we can start to explore those alternative ways of responding.
Okay, so starting with awareness. Now that's something our listeners can start doing today.
Absolutely.
Welcome back to the deep dive. As we are talking about taking off this vulnerability armor, I keep thinking back to that MFT students review and how her program actually prepares students for the discomfort of growth.
Oh, that's a great point. Their approach really embodies Brown's message. Instead of trying to avoid discomfort, they normalize it. They acknowledge upfront that growth and learning are going to be messy and uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's like giving yourself permission to feel the fear, the shame, the uncertainty without judging yourself.
Exactly.
Or trying to push those feelings away.
Yeah, when we resist discomfort, we actually give it more power. But when we lean into it, we build resilience. We realize that those tough emotions won't destroy us.
Right.
We learn to ride the waves.
Okay, I'm starting to get this. But knowing where to start can still feel overwhelming. What's one practical thing that our listener can do today to start putting these ideas into practice?
Well, I'd say a great first step is simply noticing those moments of discomfort. When you feel yourself wanting to put up a shield, pause and ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? What is this discomfort trying to tell me?
That's so simple, yet so profound.
Yeah,
It's about bringing awareness to those automatic reactions we have
exactly.
and choosing a different response.
And remember, vulnerability isn't something we do alone. As we discussed earlier, it's about sharing our true selves with people who have earned the right to hear our story.
So finding those safe and supportive relationships is crucial.
Absolutely. It's about building a circle of people who will love and accept us, flaws and all, and who will challenge us to grow. Those are the people who will help us dare greatly.
That makes me think of those Sherpas who guide climbers up Mount Everest.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
they're there to offer support, encouragement, and expertise along the way.
Oh, what a perfect analogy. We all need our own a team of Sherpas on this journey of embracing vulnerability and living wholeheartedly.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into daring greatly, I think the key takeaway is this. Vulnerability is a practice, not a destination. It's about showing up every day and choosing courage over comfort, connection over perfection.
And it's about remembering that we are all perfectly imperfect, worthy of love and belonging just as we are.
So dear listener, what resonated most with you today? Where in your life do you see opportunities to embrace vulnerability, lean into discomfort? What small step can you take today to start living more wholeheartedly? Until next time, keep diving.